If you stand at the end of Willow Bend Court today, the street looks normal, almost painfully normal. Fresh paint on the houses, trimmed hedges, quiet, polite families who wave at passing cars. No one would guess that this cul-de-sac once hosted one of the most disturbing neighborhood events in state history. No one would imagine the night when a quiet HOA community learned what lived beneath their foundations, or why the surviving residents now refuse to speak about what happened here. But this documentary is not built on silence. It is built on the truth, ugly, rotting, trembling truth that the HOA spent decades burying behind polished fences and clean driveways. The story begins with a family that moved in just after New Year's. The Graves family. Michael Graves, 42, his wife, Eleanor, 39, and their daughter, Lily, 14. They moved here to start over. A fresh beginning after Michael's business collapsed in the city. A new chapter after Eleanor's extended hospital. A peaceful environment for Lily, who hadn't spoken much since the incident she never told anyone about. For the first 2 weeks, the neighborhood looked like the kind of place where nothing unusual could ever happen. They attended HOA orientation. They paid their dues. They learned the local rules. Grass no taller than 2 inches. Trash cans hidden. No unapproved renovations. Curtains must be white from the outside. Simple things. Harmless things. Or so they thought. But there was something the HOA didn't tell them. Rules that were never discussed during the warm welcome dinners. Rules that weren't printed in the handbook. Rules that every long-term resident obeyed without question. Because breaking those hidden rules meant the neighborhood changed. The ground changed. The walls changed. And something began to wake. The first sign came on the night of January 22nd. The power went out. Not in the whole neighborhood. Just in the Graves house. Michael was in the garage, unpacking the last boxes. Eleanor was in the kitchen. Lily was in her room. And at exactly 11:03 p.m., every light, appliance, and outlet in the house died simultaneously. Not flickered, died. The garage door shut by itself. The hallway lights went black. Lily's bedroom lamp popped like a firecracker. And the temperature in the entire house dropped by 15 degrees in less than a minute. Michael grabbed a flashlight. Eleanor called his name. Lily stood at the top of the stairs, shivering. Then they all heard it. A slow, heavy exhale. One long breath through the vents, as if someone was standing behind every wall at once. That was the night the Graves family learned Rule 19, a rule not written anywhere. A rule whispered by their neighbor, Mrs. Termer. The next morning, as she handed Eleanor a covered baking dish she didn't ask for. "You must keep a light on in every room after midnight," she said quietly, almost trembling. "Alba, don't break that rule again." The Graves family did not sleep well after that, and the HOA handbook suddenly didn't feel complete. By the end of the week, more signs appeared. The family woke to find dirt mounds on their backyard lawn, perfectly circular, 3 feet wide, spaced evenly like someone was marking locations. Eleanor started hearing knocking inside the walls, always around 3 a.m., never rhythmic, always purposeful. Lily found muddy footprints in her room on a morning when no one entered her window or her door. Michael discovered that his garage shelves were rearranged every night, despite him locking the door. The HOA gave polite but firm responses. It's normal for older homes. It's just settling. It's part of the neighborhood's history. History. That word came up again and again. The HOA president, Harold Reese, repeated it with an almost reverent softness. "This neighborhood has history, Mr. Graves. Very old history." But the Graves family didn't understand what that meant. Not until the night of the first inspection. It was January 31st. An HOA notice slipped under their front door at 1:17 a.m. Not mailed, not emailed, physically slid under the door while the family slept. It was handwritten. "Mandatory night inspection. Do not leave your bedroom between 2 a.m. to 3 a.m. Keep your lights on. Keep your door shut. Do not look at anyone who enters. None of them had ever heard of such a thing. Michael thought it was a prank. Eleanor thought maybe it was traditional. Lily sat silent, staring at the paper. But at 1:59 a.m., the house began vibrating softly. At 2:03 a.m., shadows moved under their bedroom doors. Heavy boots. More than one person. Slow, steady footsteps moving through the hallway. Then the voices, confirming presence, checking compliance, marking deviation. The Graves family stayed silent in their rooms, too scared to even breathe loudly. When the footsteps reached Lily's room, the voices paused. A long moment of silence. Then a whisper, non-compliant history detected. Lily covered her mouth to stop from screaming. After that, the footsteps continued into the living room, and then down to the basement. But here's the disturbing part. The Graves family didn't have a basement. Not until that night. Because the next morning, Michael found something that should not exist. A door beneath the staircase that wasn't there the day they moved in. A door with a brass plaque. Authorized residents only, HOA access. Behind it, a staircase leading down into cold cement darkness. But the HOA said the homes here were all single level. No basements, no crawl spaces. When Michael asked Harold about it, the HOA president simply replied, "Some homes create their own rooms over time. Do not disturb them." That was the moment Michael realized the HOA was hiding something enormous, and that the neighborhood was not what it seemed. Over the next few days, Eleanor began noticing more strange details. Every neighbor avoided their home. People whispered when the Graves family drove by. The mailman refused to approach their porch after sundown. HOA board members parked outside their house after midnight, watching the windows without explanation. Lily stopped speaking entirely. She spent hours staring at the backyard dirt circles. Sometimes, Michael caught her listening at the new basement door, as if hearing something moving below. Then came the night everything changed. February 4th, the night the neighborhood alarm went off. A loud siren, deep and echoing, rang through the entire cul-de-sac. All porch lights flashed. Every sprinkler system activated at once. A low hum vibrated through the ground. Residents opened their doors and stared at the Graves house with wide, terrified eyes. Some grabbed their children and ran into the street. Others locked themselves inside and turned off every light. Eleanor rushed outside, screaming, "What is happening?" But no one answered her. Not a single neighbor, not even the HOA. That's when the ground shifted. The dirt circles in the backyard began sinking, slowly, like something underneath was inhaling. The entire lawn dropped 1 inch, then 2, then 6. Michael grabbed Eleanor and they ran inside to get Lily. But Lily was already downstairs, standing in front of the basement door, her hand resting on the brass plaque, whispering something. Michael grabbed her arm. "Lily, what are you saying? What are you doing down here?" But Lily didn't answer, because someone behind the door whispered back, a voice older than anything human, a voice that circled the family like cold wind. "She remembers me." The door handle twisted. Metal groaned. Eleanor screamed. Michael yanked Lily back. The basement door slammed itself shut so hard the frame cracked. The house shook. The hallway lights burst. Dust rained from the ceiling. Then the HOA arrived, not with calm reassurance, not with explanations, but with flashlights, hazmat suits, and weapons the Graves family never knew civilians could legally carry. "Stand back. Do not touch the door," Harold shouted. "Your daughter has triggered a recognition event." Michael grabbed Harold by the collar. "What did you do? Why is this happening?" Harold answered with a calm terror that only someone who has lived with fear for decades can possess. "It is not about what we did. It is about what your daughter remembers." And that was the moment the Graves home became sealed. The HOA placed barricades around the property. Spotlights, noise sensors, underground detectors, armed watch rotations. The family was told not to enter the basement, not to open the door, not to acknowledge voices, not to. Residents avoided their windows at night. Electricity flickered unpredictably. The soil in every yard began to soften, like something below was pushing upward. The HOA stopped pretending everything was normal. They held emergency meetings every night. Board members prayed. Some wept quietly. Others wrote letters to their families just in case. And every evening at 2 a.m., footsteps moved through the neighborhood. Heavy ones, slow ones, followed by whispers from vents, drain pipes, and floorboards. The Graves home became the center of a growing tension, a storm building beneath the surface of a perfect cul-de-sac. And Lily changed. She became pale, silent. Her hair grew brittle. Her sleep was restless. She developed the habit of turning toward corners, as if someone was calling her name. Sometimes she said things softly. They're awake. They remember. They don't like the lights. They want me to see the basement. Michael tried to pray. Elia. But nothing made sense. Until the night of February 11th. The night Lily disappeared for 4 hours. The whole neighborhood searched. Drones, flashlights, HOA patrols, police. She wasn't in the house. Not in the yard. Not on camera. Until 4:02 a.m., when she walked out of the basement doorway calmly, covered in dirt up to her knees. Blank expression on her face. Skin freezing cold. Her words were simple. The house showed me what it wants. And that is where our second part begins. Because on February 12th, at sunrise, the HOA received the most chilling alert in their history. Property activation event detected. Sector 4, Lot 19. The Graves home is awake. They say every neighborhood has a moment, a single event, where its fate begins to shift. Where the atmosphere grows heavier. Where the ordinary becomes something else entirely. In Brook Hollow Preserve, that moment arrived on the 4th night after David Mercer vanished. From the outside, nothing in the community seemed unusual. The lawns remained perfectly trimmed, the sidewalks swept clean, porch lights glowing in the same soft amber hue mandated by the HOA's lighting guidelines. But beneath that polished surface, fear had already begun to ferment, quietly, invisibly, like mold behind a painted wall. Most residents didn't realize that the HOA had called an emergency meeting that night. The official notice wasn't sent to homeowners. It wasn't meant for them. This meeting was reserved for board members only. 6 of them gathered in the old pool house basement. Eleanor Price, the board president, her vice president, Leonard Hale, Treasurer Marcia Collins, and 3 additional board members whose names rarely appeared in any public documentation. They had arrived separately, at staggered times, slipping through the side entrance with hoods up and shoulders hunched. There were no minutes recorded. There was no agenda distributed. There was no friendly greeting or small talk. The meeting began in silence, and it continued in silence for almost 2 minutes. Broken only by the slow hum of the old ventilation system overhead. When Eleanor finally spoke, her voice trembled, not with fear, but with anger. "Who opened the gate?" No one answered. Leonard shifted in his chair, adjusting his glasses. Marcia's fingers drummed nervously on the binder in front of her. The other 3 board members avoided eye contact entirely. "You know what happens when it opens," Eleanor said. "We've done this for 20 years. We all know the rules." And that was when one of them, a tall man with silver stubble along his jawline, Board Secretary George Lynn, finally spoke. "It wasn't any of us," he said quietly. "We checked access logs. There was no card entry. It just opened." Eleanor stared at him. Gates don't open on their own. George didn't respond, but everyone in that room knew the truth. They weren't talking about the metal security gate at the neighborhood entrance. They were talking about the other gate, the one hidden behind the maintenance sheds, the one never mentioned in homeowner documents, the one they all pretended wasn't there. From that same moment, according to doorbell camera footage later recovered by investigators, something strange happened across the neighborhood. Small, almost trivial events, the type you might ignore during a normal night. Porch lights flickered simultaneously on almost every house. Sprinkler timers reset on their own. Motion sensors began activating with nothing visible on camera, and an unexplainable low-frequency hum drifted through the air, felt more than heard. For some residents, the hum caused the glassware in kitchen cabinets to vibrate softly. Others felt it in their bones, as if something massive was moving underground. Pets reacted the strongest. Dogs barked at empty corners, cats ran from room to room, and one family's parrot, usually silent after sunset, repeated the same word over and over for 3 full minutes: outside, outside, outside. But this is all hindsight. At the time, the neighborhood had simply chalked it up to another eerie night in Brook Hollow Preserve, the kind of odd tension that residents privately discussed but never acknowledged in front of the HOA board. And yet, something did change that night, something subtle, at first. At 11:47 p.m., homeowner Elaine Porter was woken by the sound of her back fence creaking. Her husband had installed motion-activated cameras, and when she checked the live feed, she noticed something unusual. The camera was vibrating, just slightly. The image jittered as if someone were pressing lightly on the device, but there was nothing in frame except the yard, the fence, and the faint outline of trees swaying in the dark. At 12:14 a.m., a teenager named Aiden Smith texted his friend across the street. "Something's moving in the drainage ditch." At 12:19 a.m., multiple residents reported seeing shadows stretching across the road, not cast by any object, but moving independently, gliding along the concrete with fluid, unnatural motion. And at 12:33 a.m., elderly couple Henry and Ruth Delman heard knocking on their bedroom window. Soft, rhythmic tapping. 3 knocks. Pause. 3 more. When Henry drew the curtain, he saw no one. Just condensation on the glass, and a faint outline of a handprint, larger than any human hand should have been. Still, none of these incidents were reported until days later, after fear had already set in and residents began connecting the pieces. At the time, each family kept their experiences private, assuming they were isolated occurrences, tricks of the mind, or something that could be solved with a call to security patrol. But the most important event of that night, the one that would shape everything that followed, occurred at 1:06 a.m. A house at the far end of Pine Bridge Lane turned on all of its lights at once. Floodlights, interior lights, garage lights, everything, all at full brightness. This was strange for 2 reasons. First, the homeowners were out of town. Second, the house had no electricity. Its power had been shut off for weeks due to renovations. The lights stayed on for exactly 18 seconds. Security patrol, reviewing the footage later, claimed the entire house seemed to pulsate, expanding and contracting almost like breathing. This was not confirmed by all cameras, but the main cul-de-sac camera recorded something unusual. The shadows around the house recoiled from the light, bending backward as if resisting illumination. Then, as suddenly as they turned on, all lights went dark. But the true terror wasn't the light. It wasn't the shadows. It was what the cameras showed afterward. For 2 full minutes, a tall, pale silhouette stood in the doorway of the empty house, not moving, not walking, just standing, watching the street. And when security arrived 4 minutes later, the figure was gone, but the doorway's wooden frame had deep gouges carved into it, stretching from top to bottom. 5 marks, parallel, too smooth, too precise to be caused by an animal. Residents never saw the inside of the house that night, but HOA board members did. They entered through the side door, leaving no written record of what they found. The next morning, contractors arrived with unmarked vans, boarded up the site, and installed a temporary under-construction barrier to block public view. Only a few people knew the truth of what had happened, and one of them, the treasurer, Marcia, couldn't sleep after what she'd seen. Days later, in a moment of overwhelming guilt or fear, or perhaps both, she broke protocol and confided in her sister. What she described was simple, brief, but haunting. "When I walked in," she whispered, "the floor wasn't level anymore. It was sloping inward, toward the center of the house, like everything had started sinking into something we couldn't see. And I swear I heard breathing from beneath the floorboards." Her sister told her she'd imagined it, but Marcia never returned to that house again. Meanwhile, security footage from the neighborhood's walking path recorded yet another anomaly. At 1:52 a.m., a row of lampposts flickered in sequence, not randomly, but deliberately, one by one, down the entire length of the path. The camera captured the flickers moving like a signal, like something was traveling beneath the ground and triggering them as it passed. What made the footage chilling was the sound. In the background, faint but unmistakable, was a dragging noise, slow, heavy, like something being pulled across gravel. When security officers checked the path that morning, they found deep grooves along the concrete, long parallel trenches stretching for almost 40 yards, as if something large had been dragged from the woods to the retention pond. The board ordered the footage locked away for safety and privacy reasons, but they knew the truth. The gate had opened, and something had come through. By sunrise, the neighborhood appeared normal again. HOA vans circulated quietly, collecting security drives before residents awoke. Landscapers trimmed bushes with mechanical precision. Maintenance workers replaced streetlights that supposedly shorted due to power fluctuations. But small inconsistencies remained. Parents found their children unusually quiet at breakfast. One child, a girl named Lily, refused to step on the floor, claiming the carpet felt like it was breathing. Another child told his mother, "There were people talking under the grass last night." He couldn't describe who they were, only that their voices sounded wet. Several homeowners found all their patio furniture moved 3 to 4 inches from where it had been, as though gently pushed over time. Door locks across the neighborhood resisted turning that morning, requiring greater force than usual. And some residents reported their homes colder inside than their thermostats showed, almost 10 degrees colder. One homeowner found fresh dirt beneath their bedroom window, as if someone had stood there for hours. Another found claw-like marks on the outside of their AC unit. But perhaps the most disturbing report came from a man on Wisteria Trail who woke up to muddy footprints on his kitchen tiles. The prints were long, 3-toed, and led from the back door to the center of the living room, where they simply stopped, like whatever made them had vanished. He called security. Security called the board. The board told him the footprints were likely an animal. But the man insisted he had smelled something in his house that morning. A damp, metallic scent, like rust on wet fabric. No one ever explained it. Though the board did everything to suppress panic, people felt the shift immediately. They began walking faster at night, locking doors earlier, drawing shades fully closed, avoiding unnecessary conversation outside. Children refused to play near the woods. Residents reported feeling watched from dark windows, even when they knew the houses were empty. But the fear remained manageable, until 3 days later, when something far more alarming happened. On a clear Wednesday afternoon, The neighborhood surveillance system detected an anomaly at the hidden maintenance area behind the sheds. By protocol, only 2 board members were allowed to check that sector, Eleanor and Leonard. When they arrived, they found the area still and silent. The woods behind the fence were unnaturally quiet. No birds, no insects, not even the wind. Just stillness, thick and suffocating. The ground around the fence was disturbed in a pattern Eleanor recognized instantly. Fine lines etched into it, forming the same 5 parallel marks found on the doorframe of the Pine Bridge house. The gate, the real gate, stood at the far end, partially concealed by brush. It was ancient, made of dark iron so old it had begun to curve unnaturally, like it had melted in heat that should not exist in nature. Strange symbols were carved along the arch, each meticulously gouged into the metal, worn smooth from years of exposure. The gate was closed, held by 2 massive locks, except now, one lock hung broken, not cut, not bent, shattered, as if something had crushed it effortlessly. Leonard stared at the broken lock for a long time before speaking. "We can reseal it," he said quietly. "We've done it before." Eleanor knelt beside the lock. The metal edges weren't sharp. They were rounded, melted, almost like the lock had softened before splitting apart. She touched the surface. It was still warm. She stood slowly. "It won't matter," she whispered. "It's out." Leonard didn't ask what she meant. He already knew. Everybody on the board knew. Something from the other side had crossed through. Something the HOA had been containing for decades, through rituals, rules, boundaries, and fear, had entered the neighborhood again. And this time, it felt stronger, more deliberate, more curious. The board could hide many things. They could seal off houses, confiscate footage, reroute complaints, and silence panicked homeowners with protocol and authority. But they could not contain what had crossed through the gate. Not anymore. That was the night Brook Hollow Preserve officially began to unravel. The night when quiet fear started transforming into something darker. A collective dread. A feeling that the neighborhood was being observed, studied by something intelligent, ancient, and patient. And while the board tried to maintain order, to pretend nothing was happening, something else began quietly unfolding inside the houses of several residents. Whispers. Soft at first, almost imagined. Then clearer, then louder. Whispers coming from walls, from vents, from beneath floorboards. Some residents claimed the whispers called them by name. Others said they repeated the HOA's rules in distorted voices, as if mocking the regulations meant to conceal it. But one resident, a young woman named Sarah Mallory, heard something different the night after the gate opened. A single sentence, whispered in a slow, heavy breath from behind her bedroom wall. "They can't keep me out anymore." She left the neighborhood the next morning. She did not return. And the HOA did not list her departure in monthly records. Meanwhile, the entity, the one that crossed through, did not strike immediately. It waited. It observed. It familiarized itself with the neighborhood's patterns, its residents, its routines. The corridor between our world and the other side had thinned again, and what lived beyond the gate now had space to move. It had form. It had intent. And according to those who later survived the Brook Hollow tragedy, it had already chosen its next house, its next family, its next opening. The gate had opened, and the cycle had begun. They say every haunting begins with a single sound, a whisper, a creak, a breath, small enough to ignore, but meaningful enough to mark the beginning of something irreversible. In Brook Hollow Preserve, the sound that marked the true turning point wasn't a scream or a thud or a shattering window. It was a soft, hollow knock on the inside of a wall. So soft, so perfectly timed, that it felt intentional. It felt like a reply. The first home to hear it belonged to Naomi and Daniel Carter, a young couple who had moved in only 6 months earlier, unaware of the neighborhood's hidden history. Their house sat 3 lots away from the Pine Bridge property, the one that glowed and breathed when the entity first crossed through the gate. On the surface, the Carter home looked normal. Beige siding, carefully manicured lawn, a porch swing that the HOA required to be painted a muted blue. But inside, the home felt heavier that week, as if the air itself had thickened. Naomi felt it every time she walked down the hallway. The temperature drop, the slight pressure behind her ears, the shadows that clung too long to the corners. She first heard the knock on a Thursday night, 9:12 p.m. Daniel was still at work, reviewing case files. Naomi was alone, sitting on the couch with a blanket wrapped around her legs, watching a forgettable show just to fill the silence. Then it came. 3 knocks. Not from the front door, not from the back door. From inside the living room wall, behind the bookshelf. Knock, knock, knock. Slow, hollow, measured, as if waiting between each tap for someone, anyone, to respond. Naomi froze. Her first instinct was denial. Old houses make noise, she told herself. Pipes shift, wood settles. But this sounded deliberate, almost polite, a rhythm too precise to be accidental. She muted the TV. Silence swallowed the room like a predator. She waited. And then it happened again. But this time, not knocking. This time, the wall exhaled. A long, low breath. She dropped the remote. Her pulse surged into her throat as she stared at the drywall, at the faint outline of the studs behind it. Nothing moved, and yet she felt movement, vibration, a gentle, pulsing shift that shouldn't have been possible. She whispered, "Hello?" The wall answered, a soft scrape, like fingernails dragging across the inside of the sheetrock. Then a whisper. Her name, so faint she thought it was memory or imagination, but too clear to dismiss. Naomi. She stumbled backwards so fast, she hit the coffee table. The room blurred in her panic as she grabbed her keys, ran to her car, and drove out of the neighborhood. She didn't stop until she parked in an empty grocery store lot 15 miles away. Naomi didn't return home that night, and she didn't tell Daniel what happened until 2 days later. Not because she didn't trust him, but because she was terrified he'd think she was losing her mind. But when she finally told him, Daniel didn't dismiss her. Instead, he went silent, his face drained of color. Then he said quietly, "I heard something too, last night. From the upstairs vent, someone whispered my name." He hadn't told her because he didn't want to scare her. They hadn't known it yet, but their house had been chosen, and it wasn't the only one. The HOA board knew something was happening across the neighborhood. Reports were circulating, quietly, reluctantly, through private channels. Unusual sounds, cold spots, missing pets, lights flickering in synchronized sequences. The board convened again on Friday. This time, not in the basement, but in Eleanor's own home, where blinds were drawn and lights dimmed. Security footage played on a projector, illuminated across the living room wall. Eleanor stood with her arms folded, her face lit by the grainy night vision images. "Pause it there," she ordered. Leonard hit the spacebar. The image froze on a cul-de-sac feed recorded 3 nights after the gate opened. Parked cars sat neatly along driveways. Porch lights glowed uniformly. But the focus was on a single house, the Ramirez home, where the camera had captured something extraordinary. A tall, faintly outlined figure stood on the roof. Not crouching, not hiding, just standing. The figure's shape was almost human, but wrong in subtle, unnerving ways. The limbs too long, the neck too straight, the outline too smooth. Watching the street. It had no facial details, just a faint glow around its head, almost like heat distortion. Marcia gasped softly. Is that real footage?" Yes, Eleanor said coldly. Timestamp matches the disturbances reported that night. Leonard leaned forward. But the thermal cameras showed nothing? Correct. So it wasn't giving off heat. Or it wasn't made of anything that heat cameras could register. They exchanged a heavy silence. Then the Yu family found their hallway lights flickering at exactly the same time each night, 2:03 a.m. And when they tried replacing the bulbs, the new ones dimmed too. The Williams family's baby monitor captured whispering voices near the crib, even though both parents were asleep in the next room. The whisper was low, unintelligible at first, until it said the baby's full name. Mrs. Hargrove's dog refused to enter her bedroom for 2 nights straight, barking at the open doorway with hackles raised until he lost his voice, and the Carter home, the one chosen first, became the epicenter. But no one knew it. Not yet. On Saturday, 2:21 a.m., the Carter house woke the entire street. It began with a sound, captured by 3 different doorbell cameras, a deep, resonant boom from inside the house, as if something massive had struck the foundation. Then came the second sound, a groan, not mechanical, not structural. A biological groan, long and low, vibrating through the ground like an animal waking after a long sleep. Neighbors looked out windows, terrified but frozen in place. No one dared go outside. The HOA's community rules stated that any disturbances between 12 a.m. and 5 a.m. should be reported through digital forms, never addressed personally. That rule had been written for a reason. Inside the Carter home, Naomi and Daniel stood in the hallway, clutching each other. The entire house trembled, not violently, but rhythmically, like a heartbeat pulsing through the drywall. The vents rattled, the floorboards shifted. Then the attic stairway, the collapsible ladder, slid down on its own with a violent snap. Dust and insulation drifted down like falling ash. They stared up at the dark opening, at the void, at the faint, wet, dragging sound moving across the insulation above. Something was crawling. Something large. Something slow. Naomi whispered, "Daniel." Then came a second sound, a whisper, not from the attic, from inside the wall beside her. "Look up!" She squeezed her eyes shut. Daniel did the opposite. He looked, and something stared back. 2 dim, grayish-white shapes like eyes, not glowing, not shining, just reflecting the ambient darkness. They blinked once, slow, inhumanly slow. Then the darkness above shifted, a long, slender form folding inward, like a spider retreating from light. By the time Daniel blinked again, the attic was empty. But the ladder remained lowered, and the house started breathing again. By dawn, the Carter family had packed bags and left the house, driving toward Daniel's parents' home 2 counties away. But something strange happened when they reached the exit of Brook Hollow Preserve. The gate wouldn't open. Not the hidden one. Not the iron one. The ordinary community gate. The security barrier every resident used daily. They scanned their keycard. Red light. Access denied. They pressed the call box. No answer. They waited 5 minutes. 10. Finally, the gate opened, but slowly, reluctantly, inch by inch, as if something resisted it. As Naomi watched through the windshield, she saw the metal bars bending slightly inward, like invisible hands were gripping them from the inside. By the time they drove through, both Naomi and Daniel were crying. They didn't return home, not even for clothing. The HOA later listed their departure as temporary leave due to family emergency. But the board knew why they'd left. The entity had chosen their home, and it had only just begun. Over the next several days, the neighborhood's haunting evolved from subtle disturbances into documented, undeniable manifestations. Security cameras captured figures moving along property lines. Tall, thin shapes that glided rather than walked, blurred slightly around the edges, as if their bodies didn't fully exist in this world. Residents heard voices coming from crawl spaces, basements, and unused rooms, sometimes calling their names, other times repeating HOA rules in a mocking cadence. One homeowner reported seeing handprints forming from the inside of her bathroom mirror. Another claimed his entire kitchen rearranged itself while he slept. The most terrifying report came from the Reynolds family, who woke one morning to find all their interior doors removed and stacked neatly in their living room. No signs of forced entry, no damage to hinges, just removed, silently, perfectly, as if by something that didn't need tools, or light, or time. The HOA board began losing control. Residents demanded answers. Meetings grew heated. People questioned the constant night patrols, the unannounced maintenance inspections, the strange restrictions on late-night outdoor activity. Some homeowners began packing to leave. Others refused to sleep in their houses at all. The board issued statements claiming electrical issues and wildlife interference, but no one believed them anymore. Except the board wasn't lying, not entirely. The truth was, the entity wasn't wildlife. It wasn't electrical. It wasn't a superstition. It was something far older, something that had always lived beneath the neighborhood, long before Brook Hollow Preserve was ever built. The gate had been placed there not to imprison it, but to contain its movement, to give it boundaries, to give it rules. Rules the HOA had been secretly enforcing for decades. Rules that had just been broken. One night, around 3 a.m., Marcia Collins, the treasurer, broke down. She drove to Eleanor's house, pounding on the door until the board president finally opened it. Her face was pale, her eyes swollen. "I can't do this anymore," Marcia said. "It was in my house, in my room. I heard it breathing. It was at the foot of my bed." Eleanor sighed heavily. "You knew what you were agreeing to when you joined the board." "No," Marcia snapped. "No, I didn't. You never told me it could leave the houses. You never told me it could follow us." Eleanor stepped aside. "Come in." Marcia didn't move. "You don't understand," she whispered. "It said my name." Eleanor closed her eyes, slowly, painfully. "That means it's chosen you," she said softly. "You need to come inside. We can still control this." But Marcia shook her head. Tears rolled down her cheeks. "It whispered something else too," she said. "Something I don't think you want to hear." Eleanor stiffened. Marcia swallowed, trembling. It said, "The rules don't matter anymore." That sentence would haunt the board for the rest of their lives. Because they knew what it meant. The entity had realized it was no longer bound by the gate, no longer restricted by the rules that once shaped its perimeter, no longer confined to the edges of the neighborhood's hidden boundary. It was evolving, learning, choosing. The cycle, the one that had kept the entity contained for nearly 4 decades, had collapsed, and soon the neighborhood would too. Because the entity wasn't just haunting houses anymore. It was hunting families, watching them, picking the ones it wanted, and Brook Hollow Preserve was becoming exactly what the board had always feared, a feeding ground. The entity did not want escape. It wanted residents. It wanted their fear. It wanted their homes. It wanted the neighborhood itself. And by the end of that week, it would begin making itself fully visible, not as a shadow, not as a whisper, not as a tapping inside walls, but as something standing in plain sight, watching, breathing, choosing. They say a neighborhood begins to rot long before anyone notices the smell. Sometimes it starts in the soil, sometimes in the water, and sometimes, as the investigators finally understood, it begins inside the walls. But in Evermere Park, in the cold aftermath of the incident at House 7, the rot began to spread in silence, moving like something alive, choosing where it wanted to reveal itself next. and it chose House 12. The records that survived, the fragmented reports, the tampered audio logs, the neighbors' trembling recollections, all point to the same realization that the documentary team reached months later. House 12 didn't just witness something, it became a gateway, a threshold for whatever the HOA had been hiding for decades. And the events that unfolded inside those walls were not accidents. They were summonings. 1. The night the window breathed. The official timestamp on Avery Benton's phone camera reads 2:19 a.m., but the neighbors reported hearing noises much earlier. Scraping, shifting, something like a heavy body moving along a wooden surface. One described it as a wall changing its position, like it was turning to face something. Avery had been sleeping on the couch that night, afraid to go back into the bedroom after the crack in his wall had expanded into the jagged shape of something like a twisted handprint. He told investigators, "I kept thinking it was the house settling, but houses don't settle by trying to stand up." What woke him wasn't the sound. It was the pressure in the air, a thick, invisible weight pushing against his lungs, like the atmosphere in the room had doubled. And then he heard it, a slow inhale, not from a person, but from the window behind him. The glass bowed inward, flexing like elastic. His reflection warped across the curved surface, eyes stretched wide, mouth open. The house exhaled, and the window snapped back. Avery scrambled backward, tripping over his coffee table, hands shaking so violently he couldn't steady the phone's flashlight. But the footage still captured it, a pale smear on the inside of the glass. 5 long streaks, finger marks, dragging downward. But they weren't his. There was no one else in the room. And in the corner of the video, just for a moment, a silhouette stood outside on the lawn. Tall, thin, head tilted, watching. Investigators labeled it Unidentified Figure A12. HOA tampered with footage shortly after. Evermere Park residents used to joke that their HOA president, Margaret Hemsley, didn't sleep, that she walked the streets at night, checking lawns and counting leaves on the ground. But that night, the joke became real. At 3:42 a.m., no less than 3 different doorbell cameras captured Margaret standing on Avery's porch, not knocking, not calling out, just standing there, motionless. Her hair hanging wet around her face as if she had been walking in rain. But the street was dry. Her clothes were dark, almost too dark, as if soaked in something thick. Footage corrupted around the lower half of her body, and she stared directly at Avery's door for 14 minutes. 14 minutes of silence. The HOA's statement claimed she was performing a wellness check, but the footage doesn't show a check. It shows a vigil. A vigil for something she knew was already inside. When she finally lifted her hand toward the door, her fingers didn't curl to knock. They pressed flat against the wood, spreading slightly, like she was feeling for warmth or movement. A neighbor later said, it looked like she was listening to the house, as if she expected it to answer. And on the audio, faint but undeniable, someone whispers from behind the door, "He is awake." Not Avery's voice, not Margaret's. Something older, something patient, something that sounded hungry. 3. The file inside the wall. At 7:06 the next morning, Avery uncovered the first hidden file that would blow open everything the HOA had been hiding. He wasn't looking for it. He'd simply picked up a broom to sweep the shattered bits of glass that had fallen from the breathing window when he noticed a thin draft coming from a hairline crack in the wall near the baseboard. He touched it. The crack widened, slowly, deliberately, almost like it recognized H. Behind the sheet of plaster, something fluttered, paper, brittle and decayed. Avery pulled on it carefully, half expecting the wall to collapse or the entity he had felt the night before to lash out. Instead, a folded packet slid free like a cough from a dying throat, stamped with the Evermere Park HOA address and a date, 1979, Cycle 1 documentation. Inside were old black-and-white photographs of the neighborhood still under construction. But the houses were wrong. The foundations were shaped like symbols, circles, hooks, intersecting spirals carved into the concrete before any walls were raised. Beneath one photo was a handwritten note. House 12, threshold host. House 7, containment vessel. House 9, anchor point. Another photo showed a woman standing inside an unfinished living room, smiling awkwardly at the camera, unaware of the towering shadow rising behind her from the bare stud walls. It wasn't a trick of the light. And under that photo, someone had scratched out the typed caption and replaced it with, "First attempt failed. Entity still unbound." Avery dropped the packet. The air tightened around him instantly. From somewhere deep in the house, somewhere beneath the floorboards, something began to move. Slow, heavy, crawling through the hollow spaces where only wiring and insulation should exist. As if it had been waiting for the file to be found. As if the discovery was the signal it needed, Avery ran. But the house followed. 4. The entity doesn't want him to leave. Neighbors reported seeing Avery sprint out of House 12 at 7:12 a.m., barefoot, shirtless, and shaking violently. But what disturbed investigators wasn't Avery's escape. It was what came after. The house shifted. Several witnesses claimed they saw the front door slam shut by itself. The windows darkened. The porch boards creaked inward, bowing down like something heavy was pressed. And then the house released a sound, not like settling wood or a breaking beam. No, it was a groan, long, deep, human, a sound of disappointment or hunger or longing. One neighbor said it sounded like the house was upset he got out. But the most frightening detail came from the HOA maintenance worker, who arrived minutes later, responding to a structural emergency call. He said, "When I reached for the doorknob, it burned me. Not like heat, like something was alive under the metal." The Evermere Park HOA later issued a formal statement claiming the incident was caused by faulty wiring. But the EMTs on scene told a very different story. Avery wasn't in shock. He wasn't delirious. He wasn't hallucinating. He kept repeating one sentence over and over. "The house doesn't want me to leave." 2 nights later, the HOA held an emergency meeting inside the community center. All board members were present. 27 residents attended. All phones were placed in a locked basket near the entrance. All windows were covered. All interior lights were dimmed to their lowest setting. The minutes of the meeting never surfaced. The security camera logs were erased. But one attendee, the last surviving attendee, eventually spoke to the documentary team, not on the record, not voluntarily, but because in his words, "If I don't tell someone, the house wins." He said that Margaret Hemsley opened the meeting with a sentence no one expected. "The cycle has resumed. We must finish what our predecessors failed to bind." The residents thought she was talking about flooding, or break-ins, or the violent shift in Avery's house. But then the room lights flickered. And the maintenance chief, Harold Quinn, stood and unfolded a blueprint, not of the neighborhood, but of a sigil. A massive symbol, one that mirrored the layout of Evermere perfectly. House 12 was the threshold. House 7 was the vessel. House 9 was the anchor. And the rest of the homes formed a circular barrier. A living ritual, a design that required inhabitants, human inhabitants. The attendee said that's when half the room tried to leave. But the doors wouldn't open. They rattled, they jammed, they fought against every hand that pulled them. And then the walls began to vibrate. Not from a passing train, not from an earthquake, but from a heartbeat, a pulse traveling through the building. The same pulse the houses had felt. The same pulse the entity used to move. The meeting ended in screaming. The HOA declared it adjourned at 9:41 p.m. But no official record of that time exists, and the next morning, 5 of the attendees were gone. Not reported missing, not abducted, gone. Their houses emptied overnight, furniture left behind, food still on countertops, cars in driveways. The HOA mailed relocation notices 2 days later, but their families never heard from them again. 6. The return to House 12. Avery knew they would come for him. Not the entity. He believed that part might already belong to him, like a parasite that had marked him. He meant the HOA, and he was right. 3 board members knocked on his temporary residence at 3 a.m., claiming they wanted to help him stop the spreading influence. But Avery refused. He had seen too much. He had the file, and he understood the real truth. The entity wasn't the intruder. It wasn't the threat. The HOA had summoned it. The HOA had fed it. And now they were trying to complete the ritual that their predecessors had failed to finish in the 70s. Avery waited until dawn. Then he walked back toward House 12. Not out of bravery. Out of inevitability. He felt it. The invisible string pulling him back. Like the house had imprinted on him. Like he had become part of the ritual. Every step closer tightened the air around him. Every foot of distance closed his throat a little more. When he reached the driveway, the front door opened on its own. Just a crack. Just enough to welcome him inside. And the house exhaled. A warm breath of stale air, heavy with dust and mold and something metallic. The smell of old blood. Investigators later found marks on the floor. Drag marks leading toward the basement. But the basement had been sealed decades ago. No stairs, no visible door, just smooth drywall across the wall. But the drag marks continued through the wall, as if it wasn't solid, as if someone or something had been pulled in. Avery stepped forward. That's when the voice returned. Not from the walls, not from beyond, from inside the house itself. You were chosen first. A pause, long enough for the breath in Avery's lungs to freeze. But you won't be the last. The door slammed shut behind him. The house groaned again. Something shifted beneath the floor. And the documentary narration always pauses here, always goes still, before delivering the final line of Part 4. That was the moment the entity stopped hiding, and the HOA stopped pretending they could control it. When investigators and documentary researchers reconstructed the timeline of Evermere Park, there was one moment, one exact timestamp, where everything that had been hidden, denied, manipulated, rewritten, and sealed finally rose to the surface. That moment was the return of Avery Benton into House 12. People often ask why he went back, why anyone would willingly step inside a home that had breathed, whispered, cracked open its own walls, and exhaled a voice old enough to predate the neighborhood itself. But the truth, as uncovered by psychological analysts, was simple. Avery never left the house. Not mentally, not spiritually, not in the way that mattered. The entity had seated itself inside him long before he ran out barefoot that morning. The house had marked him, leaving something behind in the air he breathed, in the floor beneath his feet, in the vibration of the walls that pulsed like arteries. And when he crossed the threshold again in Part 4, the entity simply resumed. This is where Part 5 begins, and where the documentary reveals the part of the story that the HOA tried harder than anything else to bury. Because Part 5 is the night the basement opened, the night the ritual reignited, the night the entity made its first physical choice, and the night the neighborhood finally understood. Evermere Park wasn't built on land. It was built on a mouth. The house closed around him. The moment Avery stepped inside House 12, the door slammed behind him, an act so violent that nails ripped out from the frame. The wooden edge splintered inward as if struck by a hammer. But a structural engineer who inspected the scene later said the door wasn't pushed shut. It was pulled closed, hard, from the inside. Avery froze. He didn't scream, didn't call out, didn't try the knob, because the house had already gone silent. Not quiet, silent. The kind of silence that presses against the eardrums and makes the body feel weightless. The kind of silence experienced in deep caves, underwater caverns, places where sound has no space to breathe. Avery stood in the center of the living room, chest rising and falling in rapid, shallow breaths, eyes drawn unwillingly toward the far wall. The wall where the drag marks ended, the wall that was supposed to be solid, the wall that felt thin. He later described it as, like it wasn't a wall, like it was skin. The drywall bulged outward slightly, stretched by something pushing from behind, something large, slow, deliberate, like a hand pressing against fabric. But no fingers formed. Instead, the entire surface rippled, once, twice, then fell still. Avery took a step back, and the house inhaled. The floorboards expanded slightly, wooden planks bowing upward as if they were ribs taking in air. The temperature dropped sharply, and the voice returned. Not in the room, not in the walls, but inside Avery's head. You were chosen, but you are not enough. Neighbors heard the house move. 3 houses away, a resident named Lorraine Silva was preparing coffee when her kitchen tiles began to vibrate. Not from footsteps, not from machinery, from a sustained, low-frequency hum that made her utensils dance across the counter. She looked out the window toward House 12, and she saw it. The house tilting. Not visually shifting like an illusion, not bending like a camera artifact, but physically lowering itself, dipping slightly toward the ground as if sinking or bowing. Lorraine said it was like the house was leaning toward him, like an animal stalking prey. Seconds later, she heard the scream. Not Avery's, the house's. A long warping groan that shook through the neighborhood like a buried siren. Doors rattled, lights flickered house to house. The community's main power line surged and burst, and every resident, awake or stirred by the noise, looked toward House 12 with one unspoken fear. The thing that was inside Avery wasn't staying inside him. The basement door appeared. Inside House 12, Avery's knees buckled. The tiles beneath his feet changed from warm to freezing in an instant. Cracks spiderwebbed across the floor, not from weight or pressure, but from something migrating beneath the surface, traveling toward the far wall, toward the thin, pulsing barrier. Avery tried to run toward the front door, but found his feet barely lifting from the ground, as if the air had solidified around his ankles. He staggered 3 steps before the house growled, and the floor opened. Just a slit at first, a slight shift between 2 boards, then wider, 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 breathing, and beneath that gap, something moved. Avery stumbled backward toward the kitchen, slipping onto the tiles. His palms burned as they scraped across the floor, but he didn't look down. He couldn't, because the wall opposite him was changing. The paint melted downward like wax under a flame. The drywall softened, darkened, then cracked apart down the center. Not outward, inward, like a metal locker being opened. Behind the split was darkness, a rectangle of pitch black that sucked in light from the room like a wound absorbing blood. A door that had never existed, a door that had been waiting. Investigators called it the manifested threshold, Neighbors called it the basement that wasn't there yesterday. Avery called it the place it was born. And he was right. The first descent. For reasons even psychologists still debate, Avery walked toward the door. He wasn't dragged, wasn't pulled, wasn't forced. The entity didn't need to force him. It simply made him understand. Every step he took, the smell intensified, a thick, damp odor of soil, rot, iron, and something animalistic. Not dead, not alive, something in between. As Avery approached, the darkness inside the opening seemed to shift, swirling like fog in reverse. He reached out a trembling hand and touched the edge of the opening. The wood felt warm, wet, pulsing. Like touching the inside of a mouth. Avery whispered, "You were here before us, weren't you?" And the entity answered, not with a voice, with movement. The darkness surged upward like a slow wave, brushing against Avery's fingertips, then wrapping around them. His breath caught in his throat, and the entire house shuddered. Lights exploded one by one. Glass shards shot across the room. The thermostat cracked open. Pipes burst behind the walls. But Avery didn't flinch. He stepped into the basement, and the door sealed behind him in a single slick motion, like flesh closing around a wound. The HOA arrives. At 9:07 p.m., HOA President Margaret Hemsley and 4 board members arrived at House 12 in dark, unmarked vehicles. They carried heavy canvas bags, industrial lanterns, rolled sigil papers, and a binder marked Cycle 4 Termination. No one went near the house after seeing them. No one dared. But the documentary recovered radio audio from one of the board members. If the threshold has opened on its own, we're out of time. We can still contain it. Not if he made it to the bottom. Then God help all of us. Margaret responded with the final recorded line before the static wiped the signal. God won't help this place. We built it without him. Underground. What Avery saw beneath House 12 was never officially documented. But he told someone. One person. A woman named Nadia Torres, a former volunteer nurse who intercepted Avery after he escaped the basement hours later, bloody, disoriented, and half-conscious. She recorded his words on her phone before the HOA seized it. Those recordings were leaked years later. Here is what Avery described. It wasn't a basement. It was a tunnel, carved in earth that felt older than the world. The walls weren't dirt. They were ribs, or pillars, or both. They pulsed when I touched them. There were markings everywhere. Not carved, but grown into the surface like veins forming shapes. And the floor, it kept moving. Not like shifting sand, like breathing skin. He paused in the recording, then added something investigators never dismissed. I wasn't walking down. I was walking into something. At the far end of the tunnel, he saw light, a faint orange flicker. Fire. But fire shouldn't burn underground without air, unless something was feeding. The tunnel opened into a cavern-like hall, massive, circular, shaped like the inside of a skull. The ceiling is domed, marked with spirals that seemed to move when not directly observed. In the center stood a stone altar, or what looked like stone, but felt like compressed bone when Avery brushed his fingers over it. And above the altar hung something suspended by sinewy, rope-like strands. Not a body, not an object, something embryonic, sleeping, beating, growing. The entity, a fragment of it, a seed, a heart. Avery stepped closer. He felt the pulse before he saw the movement, a throb through the cavern, a vibration through his bones, a hum that grew louder until it formed something like a whisper. Not external, internal, echoing behind his eyes. You opened the path. You broke the barrier. We woke us. Avery stumbled backward, and his heel hit something hard. He turned and froze. Skulls. 100. Each skull carved with the Evermere Park HOA seal, but older, more primitive, rounded instead of angular. Engraved by hand, not machine. The HOA didn't create the entity, they served it. And they had served it for decades. Avery whispered, "What did they do to you?" But the entity's answer came as a tremor through the cavern. "We were fed, and now we hunger." The HOA's last ritual, while Avery confronted the entity. The HOA board above ground formed a circle in the living room of House 12. They lit lanterns, drew sigils, opened the binder marked Cycle 4 Termination. The binder contained a map of Evermere's foundation, names of residents marked as sacrifice points, a sequence of chants in an unknown language, emergency containment instructions. Margaret stood in the center and began speaking. "We're the keepers. We bind what should remain bound. We seal what should remain buried. We finish what the first architects began." The other board members echoed in shaky unison. But every time they spoke, the house vibrated harder, floors cracking, walls bending, windows bowing inward. They weren't binding the entity, they were provoking it. And it answered. The rising. In the basement chamber, the embryonic mass above the altar writhed. Its tendrils tightened, its core glowed, its heartbeat quickened. The chamber began to shake. Skulls slid from the walls. The altar cracked down the center. Avery shielded his head as earth rained from above. The entity's voice boomed inside him. "They built our prison. They fed us their fear. They sealed us in silence. Now they open the door." Above him, through the vibrating ceiling, he heard voices, faint but growing louder. The HOA chanting, desperate, screaming the ritual, trying to bind the entity again. But the entity was no longer dormant. It was awake. Avery stumbled toward the tunnel, climbing upward, as and Avery saw silhouettes, the HOA chanting, frantic, terrified. Margaret screamed, "Stop the cycle! Stop it!" But it was too late. The floor collapsed, lanterns toppled, sigils tore apart. The board fell backward, and the entity rose. Not physically, not in form, in sound. A roar, ancient, layered, inhuman, that shook dust from the beams and tore paint from the walls. Avery felt the vibration through his spine. And then everything went still, completely still. A silence deeper than the moment he entered. A silence that felt like the entire neighborhood was holding its breath. Then the voice. "Now we choose. The first taking." Margaret was the first to fall. Not by attack, not by force. She simply froze. Her eyes widened, her mouth opened, and a thin stream of gray mist drifted out, pulled from her lungs, her throat, her chest. Her body collapsed, empty, unbloodied, hollow. The entity had taken her from the inside. The other board members screamed and ran for the exit, but the door dissolved, wood slumping like melting wax. Another fell, then another. Their voices cut short by the same extraction, their breath drawn from them like threads. Only one escaped through a shattered window. The documentary never identified him. He vanished. But Avery crawled out from the broken floor, trembling, covered in dust, eyes locked on the swirling mist gathering above the ruined living room. It wasn't escaping. It was forming, taking shape, growing. And Avery realized the entity wasn't rising from the basement. It was rising from every house in Evermere. Through vents, through floorboards, through cracks, through every hidden channel the HOA had carved decades ago. The entire neighborhood was a vessel, and the cycle was no longer preventable. The choice had been made. And the entity's final whisper in Part 5 echo. The threshold is open. Now the feeding begins. If you ask the remaining residents of Waverly Glenn what they remember about the morning of October 29th, They won't describe the screams, or the lights, or the shadows that moved like living things across the cul-de-sac. They won't talk about the strange throb in the air, or the way each window trembled with something that did not belong in this world. They'll only say one thing: time stopped. Not metaphorically, not emotionally, literally. Time stopped, and everything that followed became the ending none of them were prepared to witness. Especially Arya, who was the only one still trying to save the truth, even when the truth itself had already chosen her as its final witness. The night before the HOA's harvest gathering, the neighborhood was cloaked in a windless, breathless stillness, as if the world was exhaling one last time before collapsing inward. Arya stayed awake on the living room floor, surrounded by every page she had taken from the Ashworth ledger. But the patterns on the pages had changed again. Symbols she had seen the night before were gone, replaced with spiraling circles that looked like ink dropped into water. She didn't understand their meaning, but she understood their intent. The ledger wasn't recording history. It was predicting the future, her future. Her eyes burned from sleeplessness. Her fingers shook when she touched the newest page, one that wasn't there before. A blank sheet of glossy white paper, except it wasn't blank. Under direct light, faint embossing took shape on its surface. Page 67. The witness disappears at dawn. Arya stared at it, unable to breathe. It wasn't a record of something that happened. It was describing something that would happen to her. Ethan came back right before 3 a.m. He wasn't supposed to. The HOA had taken him, dragged him away when he confronted them at the meeting. He should have been gone like the others, but he knocked on the back door with bleeding knuckles, whispering her name. When Arya pulled him inside, he collapsed against the kitchen table, chest heaving, skin pale as steam. He grabbed her wrist with shaking fingers. Arya, the tunnels go under everything, under every street, every house. They weren't meeting down there. They weren't voting. They were feeding it. She didn't ask what it was. She already knew the word he couldn't bring himself to say. The Ashworth remnant, the entity tied to the HOA's founding, the shadow the original families bound themselves to, the force that promised order in exchange for lives and silence. Ethan's voice cracked. They marked me. They said I'm selected, that I broke the contract by trying to expose them. Arya, they said I only have until sunrise. He touched his chest, right above his heart. A faint black handprint burned beneath his shirt. The same handprint she saw on the Ashworth ledger's earliest pages. Ethan was not only marked, he was claimed. Arya began crying before she even realized she was. Ethan pulled her into his arms, forehead pressed to hers, whispering, "It's not your fault. I chose this. I chose to warn you." But Arya heard something else beneath his breath. Something whispering with him, echoing him, not human, not alive. The remnant was already inside him. The harvest gathering, a mandatory neighborhood celebration, took place just before dawn. People arrived in silent lines, wearing blank expressions, pupils stretched wide, as if their eyes had forgotten light. It wasn't a party. It was a ritual. The HOA board stood in a semicircle under the old Ashwood tree. President Loretta Crane, Treasurer Miles Richford, the silent, severe Vance, and the rest. All of them were barefoot. At their feet lay the ledger, open, waiting. Arya and Ethan hid in the shadows behind the maintenance shed. But the board wasn't looking for them, at least not yet. The air around the tree shimmered like a heat wave, though the night was freezing cold. And then the whispers began, low at first, old, like voices speaking from a forgotten basement. The entire neighborhood murmured in unison, "We remember the agreement. We surrender the debt. We preserve the order." The Ashwood tree's bark split down its center. No, a void black, cold, endless, opened at the tree's base. Ethan grabbed Arya's arm. This is where they fed it. Every disappearance, every resident who moved. A scream rose from the void. A real human scream, raw, choking, terrified. And then a dozen more. Arya's vision blurred. They weren't gone. They weren't dead. They were trapped in that darkness, fed, piece by piece, to the remnant. She turned toward Ethan, but Ethan wasn't standing anymore. He was kneeling, eyes unfocused, hands trembling at his sides, whispering, "I feel it pulling me." For the final revelation. Loretta Crane lifted the ledger. The pages rustled like wings. Tonight we close the final debt. Tonight the witness joins the void. Arya realized something horrifying. Page 67 wasn't referring to her dying. It was referring to her being taken, alive, into that void. Ethan reached for her, nails scraping the dirt. "It's not you it wants anymore. It wants me, because I saw the tunnels. I learned too much." Loretta's eyes glowed like slivers of silver. "Bring him forward." Two residents, expressionless as mannequins, stepped toward them. Arya tried to pull Ethan up, but he was too weak. His body jerked like a puppet's, strings pulled by an invisible hand. Before she could stop them, 4 hands seized Ethan and dragged him toward the tree. Arya screamed his name, but something else drowned her out. The sound of time breaking. 5. When time stopped, the moment Ethan's feet touched the circle at the base of the ashwood tree, everything froze. Not metaphorically, literally. Wind stopped midair. Leaves hung motionless like painted decorations. The residents stood perfectly still, their faces frozen mid-chant. Even the dust motes stopped drifting. Only Arya could still move. And Ethan. He turned his head toward her, tears suspended on his cheeks, not falling. Time had stopped because the remnant wanted her to watch, to witness. The tree's void opened wider, swallowing light. Ethan whispered, "Arya, listen. When they took me underground, I saw something. Something about you." His voice cracked like glass. They weren't protecting the neighborhood from the remnant. They were protecting the remnant from you. Arya stared in disbelief. "What are you saying?" Ethan lifted his trembling hand toward the ledger. "Look, your name. It was there long before you were born." She forced herself toward the board's podium, moving past frozen residents like mannequins. The ledger lay open on a newer page. Page 5. "The observer shall be reborn every 3 generations. The observer shall see the truth. The observer shall be offered to the remnant." B. Arya Sloane, observer, marked by birth, to be claimed at the gathering. Her knees weakened. Her life, every strange moment, every feeling of déjà vu, every dream that felt too real, it all made sense. She wasn't just a resident who stumbled into something dark. She was the target, the reason the HOA existed. The remnant chose an observer each generation, someone who could see through its illusions, who could remember, who could reveal. And the HOA's purpose was to silence the observer, to deliver her alive. Arya staggered back, breathless. Ethan squeezed her hand. "I'm not going to let them take you." But she saw the truth in his eyes. He was already fading. Time remained frozen as Arya knelt beside Ethan. His skin was turning gray, veins dark like roots spreading under the surface. The remnant was claiming him, taking him, consuming him. He smiled weakly. "It chose me so you could run." Arya shook her head violently. No, I'm not leaving you." Ethan's hand lifted, touching her cheek. "You have to. You're the observer. You can expose them, break the cycle, end this place forever." His voice softened. "If one person escapes, the remnant starves." The void pulsed. Whispers grew in impossible volume. Time began to tremble, as if it were about to snap back violently. Ethan pushed her away, with the last of his strength. Time remained frozen as Arya knelt beside Ethan. His skin was turning gray, veins dark like roots spreading under the surface. The remnant was claiming him, taking him, consuming, run. The world lurched. Time resumed. All at once, the wind roared, leaves crashed to the ground. Residents gasped mid-chant, stumbling. Lights flickered like angry stars. Ethan rose, not by his own will, but lifted by invisible hands, dragged into the air. Loretta Crane smiled. The debt is paid. Arya screamed. Lightning, not from the sky, but from the ground, shot upward. The void swallowed Ethan's body in one violent inhale. His final words echoed through the darkness. Arya, finish it. And then he was gone. Completely. The void sealed, the tree stilled, and the neighborhood went silent. The HOA board dispersed calmly, as if nothing strange had occurred. Residents wandered home in dazed silence, their minds fogged, memories altered. No one remembered Ethan. No one remembered the rituals. No one remembered the void. Arya stood alone beneath the ashwood tree, shaking, sobbing, clutching the last page Ethan touched before he disappeared. But she remembered everything because she was the observer. And the remnant had made one fatal mistake. It let her live. 8. The final witness. 3 months later, Waverly Glenn looks normal again. The lawns are manicured. The houses are pristine. The HOA newsletters report nothing unusual. But the neighborhood feels wrong. Because people disappear quietly, shadows hang longer than they should, and the ashwood tree hums at night, like a living throat, singing beneath the bark. Arya has spent every day gathering evidence, copying the ledger pages, documenting the tunnels, recording the chants. She is building something the HOA fears, a full public exposure, a documentary, a confession, a truth the world won't be able to ignore. She knows the remnant watches her. She feels its gaze every night. But she doesn't run. She prepares. Because Ethan didn't die for her to hide. He died so she could end it. 9. The final twist. On the night Arya finishes her evidence archive, she prints a final statement for the authorities. She steps outside to breathe and sees a shadow standing beneath the ashwood tree. Tall, still, unmoving. At first, she thinks it's Loretta. But then the figure steps into the dim streetlight, and she drops the folder in her hands. The figure whispers her name in a familiar voice. Ethan. But not Ethan. His eyes are hollow black mirrors, his skin pale as ash bark, his voice layered with something inhuman. You did well, Arya. She backs away. You're not him. He smiles faintly. I am what remains of him, and I have a message. The wind stops. The world darkens. The remnant speaks through him. We do not fear your truth. We fear what you have become. Arya's breath shakes. What have I become? Ethan's hollow eyes meet hers. The next remnant. The world tilts. Her vision blurs. Her pulse stops for a second too long. Ethan steps closer. The observer never exposes the truth. The observer inherits it. The trees groan. The shadows ripple. The ground trembles. Arya feels something inside her. Open. Slowly, quietly, awfully. Like a void waking from centuries of sleep. Ethan smiles one final, broken smile. Welcome home! The streetlights flicker. Arya screams, not in fear, in awakening.